All right, so welcome back to chapter 3. We're going to discuss cells as the living unit of life. So again, hopefully most of this chapter is somewhat of a review for you, but please don't don't underestimate the value of this lecture, because this lecture will carry you through until 202, all the way through 202. Because when we get into, as you're going to see, when we get into a lot of the functions of, the different organs at the cellular level and how they work at the cellular level, it's going to be really important to understand this lecture. So please, if you can, I know this is kind of a long lecture, but just so you know, I'm actually going to break this lecture up into like 20-minute segments because it's such kind of a long chapter. But it is because it is very important for you understanding both 201 and 202, especially the physiology side. So please, if you have questions, this is something that you don't want to like skip over and be like, oh, that's not important. It's just stuff at the cellular level. That's not true. This stuff is going to be really, really, really important for you to understand. And it'll be the difference between you understanding an entire system and just not getting it. So again, when we go down and talk about things that at the cellular level, remember that the cell is the very basic unit of life, right? And so it is our structural and functional unit of life. And how well, again, an entire organism is able to function, that depends on the combined activities of all of its cells. Okay, so again, brain cells, fat cells, heart muscle cells, red blood cells, nerve cells, all of those, again, cells, it's the combined activity of all those cells that allow us to function the way that we do. So when we talk about things at the cellular level, you're going to see that structure and function are complementary. And what we mean is they go hand in hand, right? So then when you look at cells, the actual function of the cells is oftentimes dictated by the shape of the cell or the specific, what we call subcellular structures, meaning the organelles that are actually inside that cell. So what's inside that cell, or the matrix inside that cell, all of that is going to be important for each cell's function. And so different cells, a brain cell is going to have a very different shape, and it's going to even have different subcellular structures than your red blood cell, okay? So, like, for example, we're going to talk about your liver cells, and they have lots and lots of smooth endoplasmic reticulum. If you don't remember what that is, don't worry just yet. We'll get into it. And we'll talk about this again, but that smooth endoplasmic reticulum is really important for detoxification. So, of course, the liver being this detoxifying organ, the cells inside there are going to have lots and lots of this smooth endoplasmic reticulum, or smooth ER. So anyway, just kind of just to give you a little example of how, again, that structure and function are complementary. And then we talk about the continuity of life has this cellular basis, right? And so again, cells can arise really only from these other pre-existing cells. So we need, mitosis and meiosis to be able to continue life, the continuity of life. So when we talk again about our cell diversity, when we look inside the human body, we have over 200 different types of human cells. So again, you've got erythrocytes, which are blood cells. You've got epithelial cells in your skin on the outer layer. You have, skeletal muscle cells. You have smooth muscle cells, a different type of muscle cell that lines your digestive tract. And you've got cardiac muscle cells, which is a whole different type of muscle cell, again, that makes up your heart. So we have all of these different cells, and the complexity of cells inside the human body is, to me, just fascinating. It's fascinating that the human body, with as many different cell types as it has, honestly functions as well as it does. And we oftentimes talk about all the things that can go wrong. But to be honest, if you would think that more things would go wrong. Once you finish 201 and 202, you'll be amazed that more things don't go wrong on a day-to-day basis with our human body, with everything that is going on down to the cellular level. It's amazing. So again, we have the cell diversity. The types of cells are going to differ in size, shape. Again, there's subcellular components, which means like the stuff inside the cells, the organelles. And these differences are going to help determine what the functions are for each cell, giving, again, the human body this very organized, even at the cellular level, functions. So when we look at the parts of a cell, all of our cells have some common, structures and functions involved, even though, again, they're going to be different from one type of cell, like a nerve cell, to, a liver cell. But many of them, again, are going to have these three basic parts. They're going to have a plasma membrane, which is going to be this nice, again, phospholipid, flexible outer boundary that we're going to talk lots about. And then we've got the cytoplasm, which is going to be all the intracellular fluid, right, inside the cell that contains all the organelles. So we call the intracellular fluid the cytosol, and then we've got all the organelles that are within that. And those two together make up the cytoplasm. And I say except for the nucleus, because the nucleus is kind of its own separate special organelle. So the cytoplasm is made up of, again, the cytosol, the fluid, intracellular fluid, and then all the organelles, again, except the nucleus. And then the nucleus is given its own very special category because it is the kind of control center for the cell, right? So the nucleus has the DNA, and that DNA is what's going to drive everything that happens in that cell. So again, here's your basic kind of picture of a cell, and here's your nucleus, right? Here's the plasma membrane on the outside here. And then here, all this stuff inside is the cytoplasm. So again, we're going to go through these, so don't worry if you don't remember, but the rough endoplasmic reticulum, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, mitochondria, all of that here, along with the cytosol, right, the liquid intracellular portion, fluid inside, is going to make up the cytoplasm, okay? So all the stuff between the nucleus and the plasma membrane. Excuse me. So then when we talk about outside the cell, the outside the cell isn't just this like weird void either. There's some really important stuff outside the cell, and we call this the extracellular materials. And so again, that's just the substances that we find outside the cell. And again, there are different classes of that extracellular material, depending upon where in the human body you are and what cells are being bound together. So there's intercellular fluid, or interstitial fluid, sorry. An interstitial fluid is just the fluid that cells are going to be kind of submersed in or bathed in, right? And so this is just going to be like, excuse me, this fluid that's surrounding the cells. I'm so sorry, I'm getting over a cold here. Give me 1 second. It's just like when I give the normal lecture. So we've got your interstitial fluid. Again, that's an example of an extracellular fluid. Blood plasma is a really good example of an extracellular fluid as well. This is the fluid of the blood, right? That the blood cells, your white and red blood cells, are in. And then you also have a fluid called the cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. And that's just the fluid that's going to be specific to surrounding the nervous system organs. So again, just kind of a little bit of terminology for you. And then we also have cellular secretions as well. So these are going to be things that are secreted actually by the cells. So for example, you've got saliva is going to be, secreted by different cells like the salivary glands, okay? And cells that are lining the mouth. You also have, again, certain cells that are going to secrete mucus. So, for example, in the GI tract, you're going to have these cells called the goblet cells that are going to secrete mucus. Okay, that are going to be a very important part of our digestive tract. So, we have all these cellular secretions as well, and then we have what's called the extracellular matrix. Not this matrix, but a matrix being this substance that kind of acts like a glue and kind of holds all the cells together. So we'll have this extracellular matrix that looks much like this that helps to hold cells together within a tissue. So especially when you're talking about things like your connective tissue, we'll talk a lot about extracellular matrix. Okay, but let's move back on. We're going to spend the kind of rest of this lecture really talking about what's inside the cell. And so let's go back to talking about the parts of the cell that we had talked about. And the first thing we're going to talk about is the plasma membrane, aka cell membrane. Same thing. So you're going to hear plasma membrane and cell membrane used interchangeably. They're exactly the same thing. Okay, so remember that this plasma membrane is this kind of like flexible barrier that surrounds the cell, right? And kind of holds the cytoplasm of the cell together or holds it in. And when we talk about this membrane, remember that this membrane is this kind of sandwich layer of phospholipids. The phospholipid, what we call bilayer. And that phospholipid bilayer is really going to act as this kind of active barrier, right? That's going to separate the intracellular fluid, the ICF, which is the fluid inside the cell, from the extracellular fluid, the fluid outside the cell. So again, it's the phospholipid bilayer. I like to think of it as like the doorman of the cell, right? And so it's this initial barrier, and it'll allow a few things in. It'll be like, okay, yep, you can come in. And then, when it's got something it doesn't recognize, nope, you can't come in, okay? So that's what the plasma membrane is. It's really like the doorman of the cell. And again, it's going to play this really what we call dynamic role in cell activity by really being that doorman and controlling what's going to enter and leave the cell. And that is really important for each cell and its function. So again, we talked about it consists of these phospholipids, right? It's this phospholipid bilayer. And if you remember, I'm just going to go back here for a minute. Here we have these polar heads to each phospholipid, right? So each phospholipid, let me get my little pen here. And I know I have a slide in a minute that talks about this, but I'm just kind of jumping ahead a little bit. So each phospholipid, right, if we could zoom in on these here, each phospholipid here, remember, has this polar head. And remember, that means that it's charged and it likes to interact with other charged molecules like water, right? Water has a slight charge on it. And so it's what we call hydrophilic. Hydrophilic meaning, remember, philic means loving. So hydrophilic means water loving. Then it has these hydrophobic tails, okay? These lipid tail, fatty acid tails. And they are hydrophobic, again, phobic meaning fear of, right? So hydrophobic means that they don't like to interact with water, right? And that's because they are non-polar, right? So we've got the polar head. I'm just giving it a P here. Sorry, my writing's horrible, so I'm not going to even write out polar head. And then N here for non-polar, right? They're not charged, non-polar fatty acid tails. And so it gives this membrane a really interesting and honestly, like perfect design because, you're going to have extracellular fluid right out here. So you're going to have the ECF out here. And it's going to have water. And so that water is going to need to interact with these polar heads, right up against it. And same here with this intracellular fluid. So the ICF here, right? And so it's really this perfect design because then water molecules can interact and charged particles can interact. They're not repelled away from the cell, right? But yet they can't just go right through the cell because we have, again, this phospholipid bilayer. Now we'll talk about some things can go through the cell, things that are not very charged and things that are small can get through and go right through that membrane. And we'll talk about that in the next 20-minute lecture. But that gives you just an idea of that phospholipid bilayer. Again, pretty awesome. So again, the membrane again consists of these phospholipids. They form this kind of flexible lipid bilayer. And then there are membrane proteins that are kind of floating through the membrane. And we refer to this as what we call the fluid mosaic model. And what that means is the membrane, this phospholipid bilayer, is actually a mosaic of these proteins. You can see some of these proteins, and you could kind of picture them bobbing in this kind of sea of phospholipids, and they can even move within that phospholipid bilayer. So again, it's a very fluid membrane. And then we also have some of these surface sugars on the outside of the membrane here that make up what's called the glycocalyx. And we'll talk about this glycocalyx being these very important kind of the sugar coating that is very important for cell-to-cell recognition, very important for the immune system to be able to recognize self cells versus non-self cells. So, and the membrane structures really are going to help to hold cells together through these, what we call cell-to-cell junctions when we're talking about making up things like tissues. So we'll talk about some of those cell-to-cell junctions as well. Okay. So again, this is that kind of fluid mosaic model. And you can see here is this layer of the phospholipid bilayer, right? And then here you're going to have these proteins. And we'll talk about these proteins that are in the membrane. Some of them are going to be what we call integral proteins. And they're going to be literally integrated in the membrane. And then we're going to talk about some of them are just peripheral proteins, and they're usually attached to an integral protein, but they're usually on the periphery of either side of the cell membrane. So either on the extracellular side or the intracellular side. So again, the plasma membrane has all these great functions. It acts as this mechanical barrier, right? Separating the extracellular and intercellular environments. It's what we call selectively permeable. So it allows some things through, but not others. And it will allow us, we'll talk more about this a little later, so I'm not going to get into this yet, but it will allow us to set up what's called an electrochemical gradient. And this becomes very, very important for nerve conduction and muscle contraction. So we'll get into that a little later. It also allows for communication between cells. It allows for cells to recognize each other. Again, we'll talk more about that with this glycocalyx layer coming up here. And then it'll also allow for cell signaling. So there are these plasma membrane proteins here that we talked about can interact with certain chemical messages, and cells can, literally talk to each other through these chemical messages and relay messages. So the plasma membrane is really important, and that's why we are going to spend so much time talking about it. Now, there are not only just proteins in the membrane, but there are also lipids in the membrane, right? Of course, the lipids of the, phospholipids themselves, right? The fatty acid tails. So, about 75%, the lipid bilayer is made up of these phospholipids, right? So they have these again, phosphate heads, just like we talked about, the polar charged heads, and then the hydrophilic water-loving tails, okay? And so we kind of sorry, I jumped ahead and already talked about those, but here's kind of my information on that. And then about 5% are these glycolipids, these lipids oftentimes with sugar groups on the outer membrane. And these sugar groups are often what makes up your glycocalyx layer. Okay, so those are really important for, again, we're going to talk about in just a minute, things like cell-to-cell recognition. Okay. And then, believe it or not, about 20% of your membrane is made up of the stuff, cholesterol, okay? And so we always kind of think of cholesterol as a negative thing, but we don't ever really spend time talking about the fact that we need cholesterol, and it's really important for our cell membranes. And so we need, you'll see here in yellow here, they've drawn the cholesterol molecules within the membrane, and cholesterol is really important for increasing membrane stability. And the reason that is that cholesterol helps to allow the fluidity of the membrane and helps it maintain itself and its structure when temperatures are higher and lower. Again, up to a point, of course, right? So what I mean is that those cholesterol molecules, when a cell is exposed to warmer temperatures, the cholesterol actually makes the membrane a little less fluid, kind of helping to hold the phospholipids together and keep them from kind of spreading out or melting away, right? Okay. But then they also, on the other extreme end of things, in cold temperatures, the cholesterol actually helps to keep the membrane from freezing by kind of hindering or preventing the really close packing of those phospholipids and helping to keep the fluidity of the membrane even in these colder temperatures. Okay. Now, again, obviously that's to a point. You're too extreme on either end and your cells are in trouble. But we have cholesterol to thank for the ability of our cell membranes to kind of maintain that stability through, again, some changes in temperature. So cholesterol is actually very, very valuable. We need it in our membranes, okay? We always just give cholesterol a bad rap because too much, taking in too much cholesterol in your diet can be a problem. Okay. So again, we kind of going back and talking about these membrane proteins. These membrane proteins are very important, again, for allowing cell communication. They make up about half the mass of the plasma membrane, so that's quite a bit. And they have all these great specialized membrane functions that we're going to talk about here in just a minute. And again, remember, they kind of float freely. So again, think of this fluid mosaic model of these proteins kind of bobbing in this phospholipid bilayer. And again, we have these integral proteins, these proteins that are integrated in the membrane, and then we have these peripheral proteins. And of course, I can't help, I have to put these memes in here just because I got to keep it exciting for you. So here's my funny meme on that by Paramecium Parlor. They do, and the Amoeba Sisters do these great cartoons and memes on, and you'll see them all throughout my lectures. And this one says, it's not a cell membrane party without peripheral protein hats. So many of these peripheral proteins are actually going to be attached, we call them peripheral protein hats because they're attached to some type of integral membrane protein. And think of integral membrane protein as integrated in that membrane. So again, when we talk about these integral membrane proteins, most of them are what we call transmembrane proteins, and they're going to span the entire portion of the membrane. So that means that they're going to have a hydrophilic region on either end, right, to interact with those polar heads. And then they have to have a hydrophobic region in the middle. So they have to have this kind of squishy hydrophobic middle to be able to interact with that, the lipid portion of the phospholipid bilayer. So again, they're going to be what we call amphipathic, if you kind of remember that term, amphipathic, Oh, I'm so horrible at writing amphipathic. If you want me to send any of these, because you can't see my writing, and then it's IC, sorry. So it's I'm horrible at writing. I need to get a better bamboo. Anyway, but amphipathic, AMPHIPATHIC. Amphipathic just means that, again, it's going to have this hydrophobic and this hydrophilic region. Okay, and so these transmembrane proteins have to be amphipathic with a hydrophobic area and a hydrophilic area to interact with those polar heads. And so many of these transmembrane proteins will actually act as transporters, channels, and carriers for different molecules coming in and out of the membrane. And then some of them will actually be enzymes and some of them will be receptors. We'll actually talk about this. I've got a slide on that in just a minute. And then again, our peripheral proteins we call them peripheral protein hats. You can think of my lovely meme back here. So because they're just attached to, again, integral proteins. And so oftentimes they're going to have like filaments coming off on the intracellular surface that helps provide kind of the cytoskeleton, the skeleton inside the cell. It'll also, help provide some support for the actual plasma membrane itself. And then they also can function as enzymes, again, catalyzing reactions within the cell. They can also function as kind of motor proteins for changing the shape of the cell during something like cell division or muscle contraction. And then they're also sometimes very important for cell-to-cell connections, so connecting one cell to another. And you'll see this in just a few minutes. So again, this just shows you, here's some of your integral membrane proteins here. Okay, and again, these ones, some of those integral membrane proteins don't span the entire membrane, but most of them do. And when they do span the entire membrane, we call them those transmembrane proteins because they go all the way through. They're amphipathic. And then, of course, again, we got those peripheral protein hats there. So again, these membrane proteins are going to perform many tasks, and we talked about the fact that they'll help transport things across the plasma membrane. So again, they oftentimes will provide this kind of hydrophilic channel for molecules that are charged and large. So we say, what can't cross the membrane? And it's things that are large and charged. So you can think of, the saying large and in charge. Think of large and charged. Those are the things that can't just cross the plasma membrane easily. So they're oftentimes going to need a transport protein. So these transport proteins will have some type of hydrophilic channel to allow those large and charged molecules to get across. And we'll talk about some of these transport proteins can even transport against a concentration gradient using ATP. So they'll be very important later on. Then we have these, some of them are simply just receptors for signal transduction. So this is going to be important in terms of, this will actually be really, really important because we're going to talk a lot about receptors really throughout the whole semester, but especially in the endocrine system because all your hormones are going to work this way. So hormones are going to be these little chemical messengers, and they're going to have to, attach to some type of protein receptor, just like this here in the membrane, to be able to, have its effect on that cell. So again, these receptors are going to be really important. We have all different types of chemical signals. Hormones, again, are just being one of them. But just to give you an example, like, when you feel pain, right? It's because you're getting these certain chemical signals that are working on things like your nociceptors, which are a certain type of receptor dedicated to pain. So you can, every time you feel pain, you can thank your pain receptors for that. Thanks, pain receptor. And it's just, again, simply these proteins that are in your membrane that are allowing this to happen. Also, when we talk about things like type 2 diabetes, we'll talk about kind of the down regulation of receptors for insulin, so the insulin signal. And those are down regulated in type 2 diabetes. So again, it's really important to understand these receptors, not only for the normal functioning of the human body, but also for diseases as well. And then, of course, the membrane, again, is going to attach to certain cytoskeletal elements, both on the inside of the cell. It'll attach to, filaments to help, again, really help give structure for the plasma membrane, but also to even help maintain the cell shape inside, but also on the outside of the cell as well, to help make up that extracellular matrix. So you can see that here. And then, of course, these membrane proteins can act as enzymes themselves. So they can actually act to help catalyze certain reactions inside the cell. So again, very important for enzymatic activity. Also, they can help join cells together, so from one cell to another. And so we call these membrane proteins that help one cell adhere to another CAMs, cell adhesion molecules. And these can kind of provide oftentimes like these little temporary binding sites that help to guide one cell to migrate and move to another area, or also just to help with cell-to-cell interactions. And then, of course, we even have cell-to-cell recognition with these membrane proteins. And we talked about that with this glycocalyx. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But that glycocalyx is oftentimes recognized again by one of these integral proteins. So again, those proteins are very important in cell-to-cell recognition. So let's talk about that glycocalyx layer. Again, this glycocalyx layer is this kind of crazy sugar coating. I like to think of it as the sugar coating on the outside of the cell, right? And so if you look on the outside of the cell, there's this layer of like sugars, carbohydrates sticking out of the cell surface. And that layer is really important. And some of those sugars, again, we talked about are attached to lipids. We call them glycolipids. And then some are attached to proteins. But that's a little less important than understanding their function, honestly. And so I really want you to think of the glycocalyx layer as important for cell-to-cell recognition, okay? It's basically like your kind of luggage tag on your luggage that helps you identify your luggage. That's like what these little markers are. And so the glycocalyx layer helps cells recognize other cells, and it really helps your cells to recognize self cells from non-self cells, which is obviously very important. So that's mostly important, especially to the immune system. So that's your glycocalyx layer. And so here I just put this so you can see this glycocalyx layer in green here sticking up. Those are your glycocalyx carbohydrates. Now, just kind of as for clinical reference, the glycocalyx of some cancer cells actually can change so incredibly rapidly that the immune system actually can't recognize the cell as being damaged. And that becomes a problem because, again, of course, this mutated cell then is allowed to replicate instead of being destroyed. So kind of interesting clinical application of that. Okay, so really quick, I'm going to talk about cell-to-cell junctions and then we'll stop here. So when we talk about cell junctions, some of your cells are going to be free, okay? They're free at last, right? And those are going to be things like your blood cells. They're not attached to each other, right? They're free to be able to move through your plasma. And then we've got same with sperm cells, right? Obviously, clearly, they need to be able to be free to move, right? And then but most of our cells are going to be bound together to form our tissues and organs. And there are three major ways that these cells can be bound together. They can be bound together through these tight junctions. So I like this. It says, got leaks? Not with this belt-like junction. So these tight junctions are not leaky at all. And then we've got desmosomes, which are bound together for super mechanical strength, meaning if you like try to pull them apart, okay, the desmosomes are really going to rivet those two cells together. And then we have gap junctions where they say sharing is caring. And so, these are going to have ion channels that we'll talk about allowing things to move from one cell to the other. So we'll talk about all these in just a minute, but again, you got to love Amoeba Sisters. So please always feel free to reference back to these cartoons because I think they help visually give you, an idea really of what's going on. So don't worry about plasmodesmata because they're plant cells. Even though I love to talk about plasmodesmata, but another class, not here. So you don't have to worry about those here. So again, our tight junctions are going to be these, impermeable junctions that are going to form these kind of continuous. So here you can see I zoomed in on this tight junction here. And so when we talk about these tight junctions, they're going to prevent molecules from passing through that intracellular space. So these are going to be these integral proteins in the membranes that are going to help fuse one cell to the next cell, kind of like the zipper of like a Ziploc bag. Again, they're going to prevent molecules from passing through that extracellular space. Okay, so those are our tight junctions. And then we have our desmosomes. So here you can see, here's your desmosomes right here. And these are going to be these anchoring junctions that really are going to kind of bind the adjacent cells together. They're going to act kind of like Velcro and really help form this kind of internal tension reducing network of fibers, meaning that what it's going to do is it's going to keep these cells from tearing apart even when they're under mechanical stress. So it's kind of going to act like this. These fibers of the desmosome here are going to really help act like this, like these guy wires. And they're going to help to kind of distribute the tension, okay, throughout the cells. So this is really important to help reduce the chance of these cells from tearing apart when they're subjected to pulling forces, especially things like, in the skin, when you're pulling up your skin, if you pull up your skin, it's these desmosomes that help to keep the cells from tearing apart. And then also when your heart contracts, right? And your heart's constantly beating and contracting. And so these desmosomes really help to keep those heart cells from tearing apart under that mechanical stress. And then lastly, we have gap junctions. And gap junctions are really these communicating junctions that are going to allow ions to pass from one cell to the other. This is going to be really important in heart cells as well, because this will allow the heart to contract all together, all the heart muscles to contract all together because they're kind of sharing ions from one heart cell to the other. So you have this nice flow of ions. So it's very important, again, for things like heart cells, for embryonic cells, to be able to share, okay, again, through these channels, what's happening inside one cell to the next. Okay, so we're going to go ahead. I'm going to stop here. We'll talk about membrane permeability in the next lecture here.